Thanks very much for coming, and apologies for being late. I suppose what we want to do tonight is I'm going to introduce the three brilliant speakers that we have, and then we really want a lot of interaction because there's so much to discuss. We could be here all night. I find that's why I was down in Starbucks for about 11 hours today as well. So let me just go through, I suppose, some of our speakers. We have Noel Kelly, who's a director of Visual Arts Ireland. We have Clymene Christoforou, co-director of the ISIS Arts in Newcastle, and you'll be talking specifically about that news yesterday that we heard from about UK capitals or UK cities. And we also have Tom Creed, who's a Dublin-based theatre and opera director. So I think I might ask Noel to start first, if you don't mind, Noel. Maybe just give us your presentation. Sorry, apologies.
Thank you. I'm kind of getting a bit practiced at this. This is my 5th presentation and discussion about Brexit in a matter of 2 weeks. I'm now calling myself the Minister of Misery because I've no good news. We're contextualizing Brexit. First of all, just to explain, Visual Artists Ireland is an all-Ireland body. This means that we represent not only the artists in the Republic, but also the artists of Northern Ireland, which gives us a UK remit. It means that we're funded by the Arts Council in the South, and we're also funded by the Arts Council in Northern Ireland. So therefore, Brexit has actually already started hitting us. Brexit is not something we're waiting for. We already have the effects of Brexit. So I have a dirty secret, and that is, before I joined the art world, I actually was an economist, and it's really embarrassing, but I kind of love statistics and figures. So looking at some of the research that's been done specifically by the World Bank, Brexit as a phenomena is not a surprise. It is indicative of a great change in our society. It's indicative of the rise of populism. And it is also indicative of something the World Bank has been writing a lot of research on, and that is that the world economy has been in a stasis and a state of global decline since 1970. So we are actually, when we talk about the good times, we do see certain uplifts, but actually we're in a declining world economy that is waiting for the next great industrial revolution. And Brexit is just indicative of the chaos caused in this waiting. So on that happy note, one of the things, just to give you an idea of why it's already with us, when Brexit went through, sterling collapsed. We lost 6% of our funding overnight. So all of a sudden, we had to start looking at how we were going to do business in the future, looking after not only the members in Northern Ireland, but also the members in the South. And also we had to start looking at how we were going to respond not only to the EU, but also to the Republic and also to the United Kingdom, specifically Westminster. Obviously it's more difficult in Northern Ireland because in Northern, and when I say we, just this is my bipolarness, that sometimes I say we and I mean Northern Ireland because we represent in Northern Ireland. So sometimes I say we and I mean the South, so let's just take it, I mean the whole island. In Northern Ireland we have no assembly, so we actually are dependent on the civil servants to state our case in the bigger sort of Westminster picture. The unfortunate thing is many in our sector believe Brexit has nothing to do with them. They're actually quite blatant in saying, one, it'll never happen. It's the most ridiculous thing ever. It can never happen. And at best what they're saying is very glib comments of, oh, you know, we've had disasters in the past, you know, Brexit will have some sort of effect, but, you know, we don't have to worry about it. The really unfortunate thing is that it will affect everybody. And when we say everybody, we mean quite literally every citizen in the country. Because as well as the difficulties that Brexit is going to cause, which I'll come to, We are also looking at the effect that Brexit is already having on the economy, expendable income, and the expendable income is the basis for engagement with culture. And when that suffers, there's evidence to show that culture directly suffers as well. So, as I say, many people believe Brexit has nothing to do with them. Now, a bit of an eye-opener, and it was kind of like a bit of a wake-up call with my colleagues in Brussels, who told me, it's okay, don't panic, Brexit's just a regional issue. We don't care. This is for Ireland to sort out its way, and it's for the United Kingdom to sort it out. We actually don't care because it's just regional. So therefore, we have no real major interest. Now, for those of you who follow the media in the United Kingdom, it's on every page, every day, and it looks like the most important thing that's happening in the world. It's not the message that's coming out of Brussels. Brussels is basically saying, we have 27 countries, and you know what, we're doing a trade deal with Iran. We're looking after, you know, French trade unions. We're looking after, and this is where we will focus our efforts. So therefore, this Brexit thing is a mess made, and it's a regional issue. That was kind of a bit of a wake-up call. So the cross-border initiatives, the cross-border situation has been in the news. Obviously, it's of great concern to those of us who operate cross-border to see the projects that have been funded through peace money and also the cross-community initiatives that have taken place that have embedded the peace process in a way. And as we know, the peace process itself is very fragile. It is not something that we can take for granted. Brexit has put a certain amount of pressure on that. I think it's fair to say that in Northern Ireland, not having an assembly, I mean, there's all sorts of reasons been given of why they can't come to an agreement. But when you have parties who really don't have as much interest in solving the cross-border, then it becomes really difficult. And those of us who are old enough and ugly enough to remember the past will remember carnets and all sorts of documentation to get works, cultural works, from one city on our island to another city on our island. And if the right paperwork wasn't in place, the artworks were being impounded and all sorts of difficulties. So the return to that is really challenging the exchange of culture between the North and the South. Also, we have, in talking to my colleagues, both North and South, but in particular on the border areas, it was quite interesting to hear in Newry, which is in Northern Ireland, one cultural venue has 74% of its staff who live in the Republic of Ireland. So actually the transfer of workers going from the south to the north needs to be a huge concern because it's supporting the cultural capacity of Northern Ireland. Moving from north to south is not so difficult because, as we all know, the Irish Passport Office had to ask people to stop applying for passports because they were kind of beyond capacity. We even had Conservative members of Westminster applying for passports and kind of like
them.
And receiving them. Yeah. Actually, I was in America, and it was quite interesting listening to the Americans also applying for multiple passports, but that's for a different reason. The other thing I would say is that London is a primary hub for the import and export of cultural objects in and out of Ireland from outside, the outside world. We will look, it's France's opportunity, because we will look to another hub, because it will be easier for us to work with other EU countries than it will be to work with a country outside of the EU for the import-export of cultural objects. So we're looking to France, we're looking to also to the Netherlands, to Amsterdam, Paris becoming the new hubs, which in itself is quite a shift, but logistically and also financially, it changes the complexion of costs. And this is something, not much more to say, but I will come back to it slightly. We also have, 2 weeks ago, I think it was 2 weeks ago, we had a request, a consultation from Westminster to ask what's an acceptable visa system for the United Kingdom. Now, those of you who may work in the cultural sector will know that Ireland, we're outside of Schengen. We have a difficult enough time dealing with countries that, let's say, within the EU are not as attractive as other countries. So, like for example, we were bringing an academic from Turkey recently, and he failed to get a visa. It's the real indication is, I have it here, what is it? Yeah, you have to be white, middle class, and a wealthy bank account to get a visa. Now we're looking into the UK situation. So the collaborations between the UK and outside countries becomes more difficult. But what comes more down the line is that Ireland is the third largest importer of culture from the United Kingdom. It becomes less and less attractive for us to start working on projects with the United Kingdom when we start having visa concerns and the whole logistical thing. So the partnerships start to change. And recently, at one of the other times I talked about this, we had a French theatre group speaking, and they were really quite blunt. And they said, it's really bloody difficult to work in the United Kingdom at the best of times. Now we don't find it attractive at all. So the collaborations and cultural collaborations will start to shift. In the UK context, who knows what this actually means? It's a big world. So there's lots more I could talk about, but let's do some positive stuff. So the first thing we hope to God is somebody wakes up in the morning and says Brexit was the worst idea that we ever came up with and want to change our mind. If that happens, two things are evident. One, the damage is already done. The institutions are already leaving the United Kingdom. I'll get to it. And also the trust and financial situation within England or within the United Kingdom will change. What's very concerning, though, is the cultural sector's lack of response, or the type of response. In the UK, for example, Radio 4 had a programme last year. It was hosted by the Royal Society for the Arts, and one of the script writers, for those of you who know Brookside, one of the script writers, who's quite a liberal thinker, was on air and said, Brexit means for me that finally English institutions will show English work. It wasn't British work, wasn't Northern Irish work, wasn't Welsh work, it was English work. And that was really astounding to hear, coming from what we would consider a liberal voice. Now the positives. Finally, let everyone else speak. The cost structures I talked about, but we will survive. This is the one thing about the arts. We will survive this. It will be a mess. It will be a period of unknowing. But the one thing we do know about Brexit, and as we know, there's very little to know about Brexit if you go according to the official reports, is we have all worked with countries outside of the EU. We do work with countries outside of the EU. So therefore, the mechanisms are in place for us to work with these countries. And we need one of the jobs Visual Artists Ireland is doing at the moment is, in collaboration with our UK partner AN, we're actually working on making sure that the policies that are and the procedures that are in place for working outside of the EU and the United Kingdom, etc., are the awareness of them is actually with cultural organisations. The side effect is, and I think Clymene is going to talk about it, but Her Majesty's Treasury made a statement to say they're going to cover all the costs that are going to be lost by the removal of EU funding. They changed their mind very quickly, and they made a new statement, and they said that they would look to do it. There's a huge amount of talk about the divorce fund. So even in the short term, there's going to be no spare cash. And as the discussions in Brussels were talking about agriculture, health, science, every other, there were 39 representatives from civil society sitting in a room, and each one of them was demanding their money out of this amazing pot that's suddenly going to cure everything. In the long term, it will normalise. We will find ways of working, but in the short term, we're going to see some really pretty harsh realities for cultural organisations. And I think that the positive thing I'm hoping is that some artist actually comes up with a really good body of work that actually represents Brexit, because it's quite interesting to see there's very little cultural response. The arts councils are not talking about it in public. The cultural departments are not talking about it in public. There's no dialogue in public. And it's we've been agitating to kind of like get it out there and get people talking. And I think that's, if nothing else, it behoves every chief executive officer of every cultural organisation to audit what is going to be the impact and start planning for it now. And unfortunately, it's not happening.
Okay, you've just painted one of the most pessimistic pictures of what Brexit is going to lead to. I suppose the thing is we don't really know. We've only just started, and hopefully the future relationship can remedy some of those issues. But we can talk about that a little bit later on. But Clymene, if I'd like to maybe hear what you have to say in relation to the UK, because I know you mentioned there quite a bit. But talk us through, if you wouldn't mind, what happened yesterday. The shock, the fact that, as I mentioned earlier, British cities were no longer allowed to put forward bids to be part of the European capital of culture. That was a huge disappointment. People say it was inevitable. Some people say it was incredibly provocative. What do you think?
Hello, everybody. I feel the need to be incredibly positive.
Okay. It's Friday night after all.
And before I will touch on that, but before I touch on that, the great positivity in the field that we work in is the ability of the artists that we all work with to do things, to reveal the stories and to draw threads between people who are different. And I think whatever happens, that will continue. It is going to be harder. Yesterday, yes, we heard, I don't know whether you all heard it, there was a letter that was leaked that was sent to DCMS in London saying that the UK could no longer take part in the European capitals of culture. I've been working with Leeds as one of the candidate cities and with other European cities on another programme. We've had 2 years of planning in Leeds, 2 years of working with communities and with artists for civic and community buy-in. It's an extraordinary body of work. It's been the most amazing thing to embed culture into parts of the city that have never had culture before, and somewhat bizarrely to make it the most European city in England. Suddenly everybody's got Europe on their lips. They were due to go and present to be shortlisted next week at DCMS for the Capital of Culture shortlist. There are 5 bidding cities. I talk about Leeds, it's a similar story in other places. The letter that came yesterday saying that they could no longer be a part of it came as a complete shock to everybody involved, and absolutely nobody knew that was happening.
Can I ask if it came up at all, by the way, just during the referendum last year? Because obviously you were so heavily involved.
Yeah, no, it was discussed a lot. And of course we had, and this was part of the confusion, I guess, that came yesterday. So the timing of it was slightly bizarre. It was either very, very late or it was very, very early. But to have it at this moment in time seemed a very strange thing to do.
Were you given any assurances around the time of the referendum whether what a Brexit would mean, what the implications would be?
Well,
for
we
your
knew the
bid?
rules. So the rules were you had to be an EEA member, an EFTA member, or you had to be an accession country. And at that point, the UK...
So the UK is none
is.
after that.
Well, it is, though,
After
still.
Brexit, though.
Because it is currently a member. And until it becomes a non-member, then it is still a member. And in terms of the kind of non-member or member we might be, that's still up for grabs.
So it's preordaining that there's that the UK will almost crash out.
It's
so it is
preordaining
provocative
it.
in your.
It's incredibly provocative. And I must admit, it is only yesterday's news, but we're all kind of slightly reeling from it because we can't understand the formal basis upon which that decision can be made. So everybody is now seeking clarification to see whether there's a way that can be reversed after the work that's been done.
So maybe just talk us at a few of the things that you've a lot of points that you'd like to make as well. So the funding issue obviously is something new, and the practicalities, visas, things like that.
Yeah. So in my day job, I'm a visual arts producer, and we've been working for about 20 years creating projects across Europe and indeed beyond, in India, in South Africa, in Bangladesh. On the week of the referendum, we were working in Blyth, which, if any of you know, is a small mining town in the northeast of England. The projects that we do, we're very interested in taking art out of the big cities and putting them into places where there might be least access to culture. Particularly interested around the lead up to the referendum to put European projects into places that had very strong UKIP strongholds. So we wanted to make real this place called Europe in communities where it was somewhere very, very far away. The referendum result came as a shock to many, but actually when you were working on the ground, it was really understood. There was such a distance from somewhere like Blyth to Brussels. There was such a distance from somewhere like Blyth to London. There was a distance from Blyth to Newcastle. And suddenly people had a vote to make a change. And the change that was promised and the change that they believed in would give them a better life than they currently had. So this notion of taking back control that we heard so much about, it was a real and genuine feeling in those small towns that by doing this the NHS might get better, that there would be more money coming to their region, that there would be in some way parity across the communities of our country. So we could sort of see it happening, and although the people of the town were wonderful, they welcomed all of our European guests, they had them in their homes, they fed them, they talked to them, they spoke the language that they spoke to them. It wasn't about the people, and it was never about that, but it was about this thing, this notion of control being somewhere else. So we had a feeling that it was going to come, and when it came, it was a huge shock. But it meant that we had to all be doing something different about the way that we've been doing it. And the language of Michael Gove at the time, and he talked about we don't need experts, we don't need elite, we don't need academics. Arguably the arts sat within that field and wasn't necessarily speaking to the people who were making the vote. So there has been a little bit more work in our country, and there's a lot more to do to change that notion of the arts as being something which is for somebody else and somewhere else, and to try and work a lot more within communities, certainly from our perspective when we're working internationally, to bring a European perspective into those places. And it's been an uphill struggle in the past few years to do that, but I think it's a valuable thing that we need to carry on doing. In terms of our funding, the European Union, membership of the European Union very practically offers two key things. One is that our artists can jump from country to country. They can earn a few euros here, they can earn a few euros there, they can have a software developer in Prague and we can have a dancer in Gdansk, and together they can make up a body of practice. They can do a little bit of working in one country, they can do a little bit of work in another country. So the discussions around visas and access and special visas for special artists, which are the conversations that we're having, don't actually affect the way that our artists work, because they're not always very, very big names. They're not doing very, very big contracts. They're doing a small thing here and a small thing here. And the arts world across Europe is made up of artists like that more than it is the very big names or of big companies. So the mobility in that sharing is a real concern to us, because if we have to go through visa processes, it's hugely problematic. Even working with places like Serbia, which is part of Europe, shows us just how difficult it is to then have to bring that process in. In terms of the money, Creative Europe's a great starter. It's not a huge amount of money for any of us working in that space, but it brings with it options for other forms of funding. It's not really about the money, it's about the bridges that you can build and the platforms that you can stand on, that being part of that wider programme is so useful. Now, I had a meeting, again, about 2 weeks ago at DCMS in London, and they called us in to look at what an alternative UK-only Creative Europe grant might look like. And it was, find the right word, it was difficult, it was hugely difficult, because the concept of it was looking at something that would be about bilateral relationships, and it would be about the UK selling its product to somewhere else. The wonderful thing about the Creative Europe programme, as it is with the Horizon 2020, is that this is a process of collaboration. It's about bringing the expertise together for a greater good. It's also about taking the first steps of a journey that you don't necessarily know where that ends up. So at the beginning of a Creative Europe project, you do not have a thing that you are making and selling. You have a process that ends in a thing that you might then go on to sell. But the important part of the Creative Europe project is the journey that you take together. And no individual country grant can replace that. So there is a highly unlikely that the UK will invite our European colleagues to be part of a UK-only project. It's highly unlikely that they're going to invite them to design it and to give money to it. So it's therefore highly unlikely that whatever replaces it has that same basis of equality across the programme of mutual learning and mutual respect. So we're in a very, very strange place at the moment. It's not just about the money.
And could I ask you as well, Clymene, just, you said that there was sort of an undercurrent, or you could feel on the ground speaking to people that they were thinking about voting to leave. Did you, in your industry or your community, who obviously really needs an open Europe without borders, try to explain the benefits? Did you engage in some ways about the consequences, as you saw them, for the arts, but I suppose so for most people in the UK?
This was our problem. This was our problem with the Remain camp. We had all of the facts at our fingertips. So anytime anyone could say something, somebody could come straight in and say 80% of XYZ does XYZ. It didn't work. It really didn't work. And if you look at why the Leave campaign worked so well, it was built on emotional terms. It wasn't about any of the facts and figures that we could throw back at it. And we never really had that emotional argument. It's only.
How do you mean emotional? I mean, I've heard this a lot, but also you talked about Michael Gove, saying that we don't need experts anymore, But when you say the emotional argument, because the emotional argument could also be that families are split up and access to universities for young people.
But we didn't use that.
That's what I mean. You may have had it, but maybe it wasn't part of your armour.
And it wasn't part of the armour that we used. I mean, some of us did. Some of us tried to do that. But for most of the communities that we were working with, the notion of going and studying in Paris or Brussels just wasn't something that would be on their radar anyway. You could perhaps talk about it with music festivals that they might travel to as their kids. But again, this was such a small percentage of a small percentage that would have that international experience. In terms of people who were living in the country, that were born somewhere else in Europe, they did care about the local Romanians who worked at the car wash or the carers who were from somewhere else. But they didn't quite see that they were talking about them. It was always about somebody else and some bigger horde that would come in.
Okay, thanks very much. We'll move on to the discussion after, but first, our last speaker, Tom, what maybe would you like to say about, I suppose, some of the stuff we've already been speaking about, but some of the points you wanted to make as well?
Yeah, it's obviously a lot has happened, and I think the capital of culture, that's a big thing, and in a way, I kind of feel like that was always going to be a consequence of the kind of Brexit that the hard Brexit camp are looking for, and I find the kind of phony, we're so shocked in government about this, just indicative of the way that the whole negotiation is going. I think talking about European Creative Europe projects, also film projects. I think there are a lot of things at risk. I think there are, particularly, for people who aren't aware of how Creative Europe projects work, generally on a project or on a network, there's a lead a lead organisation based in one country. And I think in particular, organisations that are based in the UK, I'm thinking of Airwaves, which is the kind of major network for emerging dance artists. A project called Push, which is a project developing innovative approaches to performing arts for young audiences, which is led by Imaginate, the Children's Festival in Edinburgh. These projects are almost certainly not going to be able to continue in their current state because the UK will become a third country, and so as a result will not be able to apply for these kind of projects. It's possible, and I know an organisation like Airwaves is looking to potentially base the centre of the organisation in another country, but it means that the employment, the focus on the UK is leaving. Similarly, in film, the fact that countries can co-produce, receive funding, but also share tax benefits across a number of countries. This is going to be lost to UK film production also.
Will this mainly be, sorry, just to confirm, would EU funded? Would a lot of some of the money come from the European Union?
Yeah, of course. I think again it's two things. One of which is the funding, and the other of which is the partnerships. And
I say Ireland probably accessed quite a bit of that, given that the UK was the lead in so much of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's if there's a silver lining to any of this for Ireland, and this is not much use for our colleagues in the UK, but I think there's a real opportunity for Ireland and for Irish cultural organisations to take on the role of the English-speaking partners in some of these projects. And I think Ireland, up to now, has maybe not, I mean, there have been some significant projects funded through Creative Europe and through other European funding systems. But I think there's an opportunity for Ireland actually to increase its engagement with these kind of programs, and it may be that networks and projects are looking for English-speaking partners, and Ireland will have to take on that role. So it's certainly, I mean, one of the capacities I guess I'm speaking in is as a member of the steering group of the National Campaign for the Arts in Ireland, which is the voluntary group that lobbies for the arts in Ireland, and that's something that we're starting to think about, which is how to in a way encourage government and encourage Irish organisations to take some of the to take on some of this responsibility and to benefit in a way from this awful situation as much as possible. Because I think already I did a little call out on social media the other day, just when I knew I was coming, just to ask if people had any examples. And I know of major Irish performing arts productions which have had major engagements at festivals like Edinburgh cancelled because of the exchange rate. So this is already happening. That the border issue, the visa issue hasn't come in yet. That's coming down the tracks, but actually already the exchange rate is making it difficult for Irish artists to engage abroad. So I think it is difficult. There's a lot of difficulties, but I think there are also advantages if we play it correctly.
Do you know if any of our Irish organisations have decided that they might take the lead in this?
I mean, I think it's all happened so quickly. There are some Irish organisations that are much more proactive in terms of these European networks, and I think most of these programs are multi-annual programs. But I think as it comes up to the next round of European funding, I think those conversations are going to be happening more.
And are most of Ireland's connections in that regard with the UK? So is it now incumbent on Irish sort of arts organisations, film organisations, to start expanding to mainland Europe? Coordinating with France, for example, or with other European countries, now that the UK isn't there anymore? Yeah,
I think as Noel said, that's certainly, and the UK, of course, is still there, and it is,
sorry,
it's still there, and I think, of course, there's
Apologies.
a lot of fear, but let's remember that there's still considerable cultural exchange between Ireland and countries that are no longer, or that are not in the EU, like the United States, for example. You know, and yes, it's a pain. You know, I've directed productions in Belgium and in France, where it's much easier for me to, you know, and go and work. But I've also directed in the USA, and you know, it's annoying to have to go to the to get the visa, but it's also possible, you know. And you know, I think we'll have to find new we'll just have to kind of get used to the new structure if we do. But I think there is an opportunity to work more with Europe. I think there are some I mean, in the performing arts, we particularly in theatre, I guess, we're held back a little bit by the fact that our most of our theatre is in English and is a traditionally literary theatre. So Britain has always been the first port of call, and ever since Congreve and Sheridan and Wilde and Shaw, Britain was the home of Irish theatre. But we are seeing, particularly in, I suppose, more contemporary kinds of performance, also in dance, organisations becoming much more Europe focused.
Australia and America,
and of course,
well.
Australia and America are still there.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course. But I think particularly in newer forms of performing arts, particularly in dance, which is wordless, and in other kinds of live performance, the natural home for that kind of work is in Europe, and people are starting to take steps towards engaging more in Europe.
You see some, successful shows, Riot and shows like that, doing really well in Australia, going to Canada, because of course we had so many Irish people who had to emigrate in the last few years. So I suppose the positive, even though it was forced upon us, is that innovation is now a very important part of it.
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, it's also it is slowly providing a subject matter also. And not so much more. I mean, more in the UK. I think it was interesting that quite quickly, some British theatre organisations, including the National Theatre, with a project called My Country, which was a kind of a verbatim a piece of documentary theatre where they went around the country and worked with the poet Caroline Duffy, and made this piece, which was going into communities and looking for people to describe what Britain was from their point of view. Or a play called Albion by Mike Bartlett, which was recently produced at the Almeida, which is a play, a kind of a sort of Chekhovian play about a woman who wants to make things like they were before and is restoring a garden to its original condition, and the kind of recklessness and the foolhardiness of that. So that's happening. I mean, recently in Dublin, there was an exhibition by Dermot Seymour at the Kevin Kavanagh Gallery, which was a kind of paintings of cattle and sheep in a dystopian Brexit border. So with sort of British flags and lonely cattle and sheep in the border, and yeah, I mean, I think people are also maybe a little bit trying to find ways which are not so depressing to engage with it.
Yeah, there's probably some humour in there, but gallows humour for now. Well, yeah, absolutely. But that is true. It's an important subject. Not only is it for creative minds, but actually, we can't forget how we came to Brexit, and also we can't blame just Britain for it. Of course, the British have had a Eurosceptic press and a very Eurosceptic governments, besides maybe Tony Blair and some of the members of the Labour Party. But Corbyn, the Tories, they've always been quite Eurosceptic. However, a lot of governments would have said that at the time of the referendum, if other EU member states had one, after what happened in Greece and Ireland and the banking crisis, they couldn't be guaranteed that their voters would have, voted to remain either. So we have to also use it as a subject and say, well, and how does the EU need to be reformed?
And I think that in the British media, there was always the joke about the EU forcing Ireland into having two referenda over, let's say, the Lisbon Treaty. But it was very, very clear in our minds that the first vote is the reactionary vote to the status quo, and the second vote was always going to be the vote of what people actually thought. And that's the great hope, that there is potentially doubt it, but there's a slim chance of perhaps a referendum which to validate what's going. But just to go back just to one point that I do think, and it's going back into the English language, there's a very small beginnings of a conversation happening in literature, because Ireland will be the one country with official language is English. I was reminded in Rome at a Cultural Action Europe conference last week that Malta and Cyprus also share the English language in some of their proceedings. But what was happening in literature was an interesting one, because the people in the publishing companies in the United Kingdom were saying, it's okay, Ireland will look after English language literature. And we were like, whoa, hang on. And they said, but you're doing it already. You have Seamus Heaney. Seamus Heaney's actually from the United Kingdom. And he's saying, actually, okay, he's on the shared landmass. You know, we can sort of like look at that. But the conversation then started to unfold. And once again, it hasn't totally formed, but it's a kind of wake-up call to, as we all know, the publishing industry in Ireland is in a very horrible state. And in a quite fragile state. And it is an opportunity of actually having these organizations from the United Kingdom coming in and actually doing a form of investment that actually would give Ireland a greater role in publications, English language publications. So that, but then once again, it depends on what that fractious relationship is going to be between the two of us.
Yeah.